Hi everyone, welcome back to another exciting and inspiring episode of On Location with Zara, produced with the support of Tell Story Hive. Today we're here in the heart of Kitsilano on West Broadway at the beautiful vegan restaurant, Folk Restaurant. And joining me is a very special guest who I'm so grateful was able to join us today because her life is truly, truly busy. So I'm quite amazed that she was able to make time for us. Has been on CBC. She's the professor of journalism at UBC. She has given talks that I can just listen to over and over again on YouTube. She has a podcast. She's an author. She also has a new book coming out, and someone I found while researching a very important topic that we'll be discussing further on in our conversation about the importance of diversity in media. I'm talking about none other than Minelle Mahtani. Minelle, thank you so much for joining us. I may say, I told you this over the phone too, I was just a little bit nervous having you here. Julian, my camera op, knows. He's like, all through the day you've just been so calm, and I'm like, I don't know, can I eat? I'm like, everything has to be perfect. I'm just so excited to have you here, and you're just like, come over here, give me a hug.
Well, I'm so honored that you'd even think about me for this, given the array of guests that you have on the show. So I feel really honored that you'd feel that way, and I'm so excited to sit down with you.
I'm truly excited. The way your name came up, I was Googling the importance of diversity, BIPOC stories, and BIPOC individuals sharing their own stories on a Sunday evening. And I realized that I needed to bring, because that is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, like being an immigrant, not being born in Canada, and when I came here, working as a model, then as an actor, and never, always trying to be everything but my own ethnicity. And when one of your papers came up on Google, I thought you were singing the song that someone knew how to put into words what I was feeling, but I just didn't know quite how to describe it. So I really want to thank you for speaking so much and doing the work that you've been doing. So we'll dig into that, but I want to back up and talk about how you first got started in media.
I love everything about this conversation that we're about to have, so thank you again for including me. I've always been interested in journalism and media since I was a little kid. When I was 7 years old, I started becoming obsessed with movies and direction, which is really weird for a 7-year-old kid. And I started going to movies with a notebook labeled director's notes. And I would take notes about the lighting and the shots and the people that were in the movies. And I'd say to my mom, why are there so few people of color? We didn't have that term back then, but like, why aren't there people like me in the movies? Like, why don't I see that? And she's like, well, that's the way that media works.
You actually voiced it and noticed it.
Yeah, because I think probably a lot of us, I grew up in the 80s, a lot of us experienced all sorts of kinds of complex forms of racism. And as someone who was Indian and Iranian, and who looks the way I do, I got it from every single place imaginable. I never knew what racial slur I was going to get, but I got a lot of them. So it was always interesting to have that experience of that kind of out and out racism in the classroom, and then later on in the lecture halls. And so that's been tough to take, although I want to be clear, as a light-skinned person of color, it's nowhere near as bad as it can be for someone who identifies as Black or as Indigenous as well. So, but having all those experiences, coupled with the fact that I never saw anybody who looked like me on screen, made me think something needs to change. So I pursued both an academic path to think about those questions, and then also a journalistic path, fortunately at the CBC, I was lucky enough they decided to hire me.
That's truly amazing. And something, I love the fact that in your bio it says that your mom shared a story about you being an observant child. The fact that you're 7 years old and noticing that, I don't think that consciously I realized it. It's only looking back now that I realized, from Barbies to the movies that I was watching in Pakistan as a child, who was considered pretty or beautiful, or when I would watch shows like that I loved, Full House and all those shows, there was no one who looked like me. So subconsciously you internalize that, okay, I'm not beautiful, cool, or worthy of being on television, that someone who looks like me, or they can only be seen as a cab driver and then later on in other roles that are not so flattering to people from our part of the world.
You know, when I hear this, my heart breaks because I look at you and you're gorgeous both inside and out. And the fact that you had to experience that on any level is just really difficult for me to hear. So I'm so glad that you do the work right now because you're amplifying the stories of so many people of color in ways that we need to see in different forums and places. So I'm really grateful to you for that. You know, it's funny, because I'm a mixed race scholar, one of the things that's come up in my research is that mixed race people, or people who identify that way, are really ideally situated to be able to observe the ways in which oppression works in very complex ways. So, you know, is it me that at 7 had any special abilities? Not really. I think it's the fact that when you're mixed, you're constantly watching to figure out where you fit in, where you might figure out a place for yourself in the world. So I think it was that experience of being multiracial that informed my experience of understanding what it meant to be an outsider in Canada.
And I wonder even questions about your name.
Right, yeah, I mean,
Do people ask you, Minelle, is that your real name? 'Cause I get asked that a lot. Zara, is that really your real name?
really?
Yeah.
Still amazing, like, you know, it's 2024 and we're still getting asked questions like that. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I was at the Mountain Equipment Co-op yesterday buying a tent, you know, and the person there said, oh, it must be Minelle Mahtani. I'm like, no, it's Minelle.
Yeah.
And, you know, these are the things, these little slights, you know, Shashibat, the beautiful writer, says it's like 1,000 cuts all the time, those kinds of experiences. And I feel like that's what it is. It's like 1,000 cuts every day dealing with the ways in which we experience these kinds of implicit as well as more outward forms of racism.
And the beautiful thing is that we're actually talking about this now, because I feel for someone like me, for a long time, I wouldn't voice this because I think subconsciously I didn't want anyone else to feel inconvenienced. And there's still times that I will hear people in the film industry who are obviously, you know, Caucasian, who will just be like, oh, there's no racism and there's none of this. Of course, look, Barack Obama was
Right.
president, and they just don't know, because obviously you have not experienced it yourself. So you don't have the compassion or the empathy. So how was it for you, you know, working with the CBC, which was a very interesting story, I believe. I don't think we were speaking about it over the phone, or was it in an interview that I heard that you just happened to meet someone who was a producer in London?
Yeah.
And then the guy was like, I'm with the CBC, and he was just the head of national news or something.
Very close, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of us fall into these lines of work through serendipitous encounters or relationships, right? And people taking a chance on us, right? Because, you know, I wouldn't have gotten to journalism school if I had applied, I don't think. I didn't have like the background, or, you know, at that point, the people who were going into journalism were mostly white students. I mean, of course, that has completely changed. When I look at the students I teach now at UBC, the majority of the students that are at UBC in journalism, a lot of them are people of color, for which I'm incredibly grateful. But literally, it was just a chance encounter on the street in London, England. I'd started my PhD, I was working at the Gap, and I was on break, and a guy walked by me wearing a Toronto Blue Jays sweatshirt. Now, I'm 23 years old, I'm alone, I'm really missing home. The guy walked by me, and I thought, Minelle, you've got to go up and at least say hi. So I went up to him and I said, hi, I know this is weird, but you must be from Toronto. I'm from Toronto. You know, I'm really lonely. How are things going for you here? We started talking. Turns out he was head of all the foreign news bureaus for the CBC. So I was really fortunate that I met somebody at the right time who was willing to take a chance on me. So I left my PhD and started as a gopher, just delivering newspapers on the 4th floor of the CBC National Television Newsroom. That's where it all began.
This is the path you were meant to be on. I'm sure people come up to you all the time in terms of asking for advice, you know, what path they should go on, if they want to be in media, they want to, whether it's investigative journalism or to tell stories, whether local community stories or conversations like this. For someone who may be watching right now who just wants to share their local stories, who's a person of color, what advice would you give to them?
Listen, I was thinking the other day about this. You know, usually, maybe 10 years ago, I would have said, take the traditional path, go to journalism school, you know, try to break into one of these legacy media corporations. But we also know that legacy media is crumbling, right? The opportunities due to ongoing forms of neoliberalism and thinking about the ways in which oppression works. I would say that people just need to produce their own stories now and have the faith that you can actually reach millions of people through social media, through posts on Instagram. Create your own stories. I think that's the way to do it now, and to think about how you want to reach different audiences who want to hear what you have to say.
earlier you were referencing, and thank you so much for your openness and honesty about, the amount of slurs or comments that you've received, whether you were working or in school. What kept you going? It sounds like you have a very resilient spirit.
I don't know. I think that's so generous of you to say. I don't know. I wish I could say it was about having a strong spirit or having faith in myself. I mean, maybe I was just obstinate. Maybe I was just like figuring that I just wanted to keep on going. But it's also about respecting the stories of our ancestors and recognizing my parents gave up everything to come to this country. My dad is Indian and my mother was Iranian. And thinking about that experience for them, I mean, that sacrifice, in some ways I felt like I didn't want to let them down, obviously. But also I just felt, what are the legacies that they leave behind for us, and how can I honor the legacies of all my ancestors through the stories that I share? And also, I have responsibility now for the next generation of students. I mean, I get to work with the most amazing students, and so I owe it to them to think about how I can create a space where they can speak their story now.
That's really beautiful. I believe it was Sam Sullivan introducing you in one of the videos that I found online.
You really did your research, girl.
Just a little bit, seeing what's out there about you on YouTube, and I feel like, even your last name Mahtani, my last name is Durrani, and, of course, like the way you would say it authentically in my country is Zara Durrani. I don't say it like that because people don't know how to do the R's, but I saw a little bit of myself in you, and then of course we'll talk about your upcoming book in a little bit, and opening some pages and being like, oh wow, like this is truly amazing. And the fact that you're here, because I was really trying to find someone who was an expert and whose brain I could really pick on this topic, that some of the thoughts and feelings that I've had and not expressed, and why have I not? And finally we're having these conversations, post-COVID, George Floyd world, that, all this internalized oppression.
Right.
And that finally we do get to have a voice, but it's like, okay, you have a little bit, but perhaps in a big setting, in a big room, not too much.
Right.
Yes, to check a box. I'm grateful that we are getting that right now, that I get this platform, we get this funding, but I do get the sense that sometimes it can be a thing to show. This is that we're welcoming of everyone.
Right.
But it's also the internalized part, and I guess part of me is like, I'm 41, turning 42 soon, that for so long I was disconnected from these feelings that I didn't allow myself and give myself permission to feel, because I thought I had to be the same as my peers,
Right.
who had more opportunities, and secondly, they were Caucasian.
Right.
So it's like hit the ground running, that there's no room to breathe, like you have to be like them. And no one thought for a second to be like, hey, how is this landing for you, what's happening in the world or the news? So the fact that you've been in this profession for much longer than I have, and you've had to bear all these things, and now you get to work with people, so I feel very grateful to have you on here. So I just want to talk a bit about how we can voice these matters around seeing. It's wonderful to see on CBC we have these amazing hosts who are South Asian,
Right.
Asian, but like back in your day, it's very different. Like 10, 15 years ago, the billboards all look different.
Yeah, they all did look very different.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question there's been change, and I'm
Yeah.
grateful for it, that we're seeing a lot more representation of people of color in journalism. But the thing we have to ask ourselves is, are we seeing change in the upper echelons of legacy media? And that's where we're not seeing change. And in fact, I would argue, since what they call derogatorily this George Floyd moment, like we have to really pull back from that, and people think that all of a sudden these floodgates have opened for people of color, when in fact the opposite is happening. Things are really shutting down now, particularly for Black and Indigenous artists with legacy media, and also just for people of color writ large, I think. And so how are we going to open up those spaces again? For a while, people thought that diversity didn't just make good moral sense, it made good business sense. And I still believe that. But since, I would say in the last couple of years, I've seen a really shutting down, a kind of backlash against diversity and inclusion. And for me, that's extremely problematic, because people like us want to see people like you in journalism and media and film and television, on the radio, and there's fewer opportunities for that, I fear, right now. So what are we going to do about that? If we take an individual stance, I fear that we will not get anywhere. We have to work as collectives and think about how we're going to make change as a group when we think about the ways that oppression works. So what are the organizations we can join? How do we take a stand against these forms of racialized oppression? I think that's where we need to move.
And that's something that you talk about in your classes when you're working with students. So what are some of the, can you tell me about some of the work that you're doing in class and what you encourage students, whether it is someone who's in media or perhaps someone in film school? I remember hearing that from Monica Deal in like 2010. It was the first ever VISA, Vancouver International South Asian Film Festival. And Zaf Peru, Monica Deal, and a few other folks were on the panel, and they were talking about how you're going to have to make your own content, and the year was 2010, and I was just doing red carpet interviews, just kind of like this, and I was like, I don't know how, like how do I do it? But it's like I've independently funded or like making no money at all.
That's amazing.
But
what
it's
you've
like
done.
just going ahead, keep going, making content, because otherwise I was like beer girl number 2 or hot girl number 3, or just always these kinds of roles which I had to turn down. And I feel like little by little there are more roles for women who look like me and who are younger, and when I see them, my heart just explodes. Like I had CBC's Allegiance is a new police procedural drama that came out, and the star came to my home where we filmed, and we were both just crying because what a moment it was that the #1 is a South Asian woman.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's wonderful, right? That at least you have some moments that you can connect with individuals who understand that experience a little bit more. But we need more of that, right?
Yeah. So let's move along. You were at University of Toronto, Scarborough, and then you moved to University of British Columbia. What are you most excited about the role you're in at the moment?
Oh, well, right now I'm head of Canadian Studies, which is such a great place to be. I mean, because what it does, it helps us shift up how it is we understand what it means to be Canadian. And of course, 20 years ago, there was a very particular way of understanding Canadian as a kind of beer guzzling, kind of old school kind of Canadian.
Glad.
Yeah, but of course that's changed dramatically, as well it should. So when I think about what it means to consider a critical Canadian studies, it's a really exciting place to be. And I get to teach courses. I'm teaching a course called The Canadian Creative, what it means to be creative in Canada when you identify as somebody who's outside of the kind of static, constricting categories of the nation state. So that's been very fun to think about. I mean, you're a Canadian creative, right? The work that you do. And so I have people come in to speak to students about what it means to be creative, to challenge all these complex forms, again, of racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, those sorts of things. So I'm doing that. But yeah, that's my major role right now at the university. And then of course, I teach intro classes in social justice. And that's a lot of fun. I teach a course called Risk, Relation, Revolution, and Repair, where I ask students to think about what it means to take a risk in order to challenge ongoing forms of oppression, of relation. What does it mean to be in relationality? Again, informed by extraordinary knowledge of Indigenous peoples who have really offered us such rich opportunities to think about what it means to be in relationality with one another. Risk, relation, revolution. How might we think about what a revolution is? Of course, in the large-scale way of understanding revolution, but also the quiet revolutions. Like your show is a quiet revolution every day in terms of what you offer people like me in terms of amplifying a space to help us think about our stories and why they matter. And then repair. How do we even move towards repair when we are living at end times? I mean, that's a very complicated question to ask, but the entire course is about asking new questions so we get different answers.
Those sound like amazing courses. This may sound completely odd. Can someone just electively come and take one of these courses?
You know, I think sometimes, if you're retired and you live in Vancouver, there is a program where you can come and sit in on classes, but I think otherwise it might be a little complicated.
Yes,
but talk to me later. Let me see what we can do.
Sounds good. Can you share some insights from your books on critical mixed race theory and cultural forgetting?
Wow, I mean, that's a big question. Yeah, you know, when I started in this field, we call it critical mixed race theory, which is a bit of a mouthful. We didn't really have that about 20 years ago. But when I started thinking about the work I wanted to do in my PhD, I was like, I'm mixed, but there's a lot of books about white and other mixes, white and Asian, white and black. But what about people like me of dual minority mixes? I didn't see a lot on that. So I started thinking about wanting to hear the stories of people who had dual minority mixes like myself. And I was lucky in that I had a chance to interview more than 20 women in Toronto who identified that way. And their stories really informed the development of my book, which I called Mixed Race Amnesia. Lots of findings came out of that, but I think some of the more pertinent ones were that mixed race people didn't see themselves in media, in different forms of in film, television, radio, and they wanted to see themselves represented more accurately. But one of the things that they were really interested in was thinking about how they were misrepresented in popular perceptions of their identity. So it's either one of two things. One is that they were torn and confused about their racial identity and had no place to call home, that, oh my God, these poor children are so messed up. Or else they were the solution for the world's racial problems, like the Barack Obama kind of idea that we're living in a post-racial world now and no more racial problems exist simply because we're seeing so many more multiracial people. And of course, both of these are stereotypes. Both of these are, in the words of a great scholar, Wamina Lubiano, they're getting mugged by a metaphor, right? That these are just metaphors that don't really help us understand the complexities of our identities. So I started to think, is there another way to understand the complex diasporic histories of mixed race people? And one of the things I thought about a little bit more was when we forget those diasporic histories, like our families have traveled all around the world to get to where we are today. I mean, I'm Indian Iranian, but even behind that, there's these histories around where they've traveled to. Like Jhumpa Lahiri talks about it as being traveling to the third and final continent. My family went from India, Pakistan, Burma, Lahore, all these places.
This is your parents?
My extended families, right? And then they went to London, and then they came to Canada. So here was the third and final continent. But when we don't trace those complex diasporic histories, there's a kind of cultural forgetting that goes on. We're not honoring the stories and the cartographies of our past. And it's so important to do that. Otherwise, we just have this one static representation of the future, right? The mixed race future, as if the past no longer matters. So part of what I'm trying to do now in my work is remember those histories and honor those histories. And given that both my parents have passed away, I have a lot of, I guess, poignant feelings around that, and melancholy and sadness and around that, but also recognize the importance of sharing their stories now, particularly now that they've both gone.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And those two words, cultural forgetting, I feel I can relate to it a lot.
Right.
Being from Pakistan and moving here at 17 and really feeling, and this was in 2000, and then, you know, with what happened a couple of years later, 2001, I really quickly wanted to forget where I was from, who I was, cutting my hair, dyeing my hair, never acknowledging or saying where I'm from, and people would just assume I'm from various parts of the world, like my natural hair is curly, Latin America, or somewhere else. So I would just take on those characteristics, and being a performer, sort of become a shapeshifter slash chameleon, and not truly wanting to own my heritage. And then it's taken me this many years, to be honest. It's doing this show and another show I did last year has truly given me some sort of peace to voice this, to not just keep this inside of me. And I think you were part of the missing piece, because we haven't really fully had a conversation with someone who is a scholar, who teaches this, who's written books about this subject matter. Because in my brain I thought I heard other people talk about this, but who weren't in Vancouver. But I think we were meant to cross paths, just like how you met the gentleman in London, and I was meant to find you and have these conversations.
But you see, I just want to say, like, you are creating a space for the next generation. Like, I guarantee you there's some little girl who's watching you right now saying, oh my God, you are the role model for her. And so by having that courage and the space to create a show like this and to invite people like me on, you've opened up a different space for the next generation. So recognize that in you too, okay?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. How do you see your research influencing public discourse and policy related to race and social justice?
That's a complicated question, but I'll have a go at it. I mean, I think that piece that you read of mine around race and media, honestly, that piece was commissioned by the Canadian government. They approached me and said, we need to understand more how it is that minority groups, and that's the term we used at the time. It's not a term I would use now because we're obviously not in the minority, and what does that really mean? But they wanted to understand more how it is we thought about race, journalism, minority identities writ large, Canadian media writ large. So they asked me to embark upon this big study, and so I tried to look at every single study I could that had been done until that point, just to see what the existing research was. And then I did something a little different. I called up every single person I knew who worked in media and journalism at the journalism schools, Canadian media, like communication departments in Canada. I said, what are we not doing around the research when it comes to thinking about representation of minority groups in Canadian media? And that was extraordinary when I heard the stories, because they were like, we need to do so much more work in this field.
And when exactly was this?
This was 2000. God, that was a long time ago. But I was really surprised how that paper took off in terms of how many people read it and felt, oh my God, this is such an important snapshot of where we are at this moment. Because the key finding that came out of the paper is we have two schools when it comes to representation of minorities in terms of the work that we've done on the research. There's either research that goes and talks about the underrepresentation of minority groups or the misrepresentation of minority groups. And I think both those spaces are really important to talk about. But how do we think about the research that looks at the kinds of accurate representations of minority groups? And that's what a number of the journalists and the researchers who I talked to said we need to look at in more detail. So now we have this incredible body of research that has emerged in the last 15 years, looking at like the discourses of racial domination. We have people like Eternity Martis at the journalism school at TMU doing really fascinating work, looking at the ways in which Black Canadians are represented in journalism. There's so many really extraordinary up-and-coming journalism researchers in Canada who identify as either Indigenous or Black, who are creating a brand new space for us to think about representation. So that is really exciting for me. But in all the conversations that came out after that research paper, I found myself flying to Ottawa a lot, having conversations with policymakers who would say, well, what do we do? And I kept on saying to them, you have to change the power elite. You need to change the people who are in leadership roles and encourage them to take courses to think about how, sometimes we call it unconscious bias. I'm not a big fan of that term, but they need to understand how their limited purview prevented and continues to prevent opportunities for BIPOC in journalism. So I'm glad I was part of those conversations. I hope I opened up the door a little bit for people who are coming up the ranks, but we still have a lot more to do.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to talk about sense of place.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I also have to say I love your voice on the phone and listening online. You have a great voice.
Thank you.
And I'm excited. I hope you're going to be your upcoming book, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
I hope it will go on Audible as well, because all I could think was she would be so great at reading audiobooks.
Well, inshallah, as my mom would have said. Inshallah.
Yes, I would say inshallah as well.
No, I mean, they have it planned for me, so it's going to be a lot of time in the studio, but thank you. I hope people will listen to it.
Okay, wonderful. So what inspired you to start your radio show, Sense of Place, and can you share a memorable moment or episode or a guest?
I love this question so much. So I did something very potentially crazy back in 2011. I came out here on vacation and I met a guy at a coffee shop and fell in love. So I gave up everything to be with this guy from Vancouver, but it meant giving up my job in Toronto as a professor. So I moved out here to be with my partner, and I was like, what am I going to do? I have no job. I was lucky that Toronto was holding my job for me, University of Toronto, but while I was here, I didn't have anything to do. And I was very fortunate that I got this opportunity to host my own radio show. And honestly, I had not done any radio. I'd worked in television as a producer, but that's a very different thing than working in radio. And I was lucky that the owner of the radio station, a guy named Don Schaefer, said, yeah, your voice is good. Why don't we give you your own show? And I said to him, listen, I want to make it a feminist, anti-colonial show that speaks about questions about like oppression. And he was like, okay. So every day for 2 hours for 4 years, I had a chance to speak about these issues on a show that I called Sense of Place. And I called it Sense of Place because I'm really curious about how it is that BIPOC people create a sense of place for themselves in a sea of whiteness, right? How do we find a place for ourselves when we're constantly bombarded with images that have us believe that we're not good enough in a world that forces us to be broken, right? So it really was a place where people like your voices could be heard, thinking about how I could showcase and highlight and amplify the stories of BIPOC individuals, mostly in Vancouver, but it ended up getting even broader than that. So it was 4 years of extraordinary stories that I was very fortunate and privileged to hear, and 4 years of learning a lot more about how I talk a lot, and I had to learn how to cut back in interviews and not listen to myself speak so much, and how to honor the story of the person sitting across from me, and how to give them the space to speak. I also learned I was a terrible interviewer, and that took a long time for me to get over. At one point, my boss said, look, we're gonna have to cancel your show because you just suck. And you know what? It's totally okay. He was right. I had a lot to learn about how to do a great interview. And over time, I got better and better and better, to the point where when the show ended, I'd won like 4 awards for even from the Canadian Ethnic Media Association for Best Radio Host, and had just learned a lot more about storytelling and the importance of sharing those stories. And I mean, I got to do interviews with some of the most lauded writers in the world, people like Salman Rushdie and Adam Gopnik.
I saw that, yeah.
I mean, the fact that they would even sit down and speak their story with me, I felt super humbled. And every day I left that radio station feeling I got the best job in the world, and it really was the best job in the world.
And I like the fact that you can see all those interviews on your website.
It's pretty cool to be able to go back now,
Yeah.
And to see them and to think, that's just a snapshot in time, but I've learned so much from them. And sometimes I still go back to them, and sometimes I play them in my classes too. Because the radio interview, in many ways, was like an emotional one-night stand, right? And you can probably relate to that too, right? You get so deep and so close to a person, and then you never see them again sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But that opportunity to sit down with somebody and to hear their innermost thoughts, it's a big gift.
And to go on the journey with them, because I feel like, especially when it's like 45 minutes plus and you start going deep and starting from the beginning, it touches you in places. Like, you know, even earlier, a few things you were saying, I was like, yes, this is how I feel. Or when I was listening to you on YouTube, or even checking out your website, which I absolutely love your website because you can find everything there.
Shout out to Sean Cranberry, man, the person who designed my website. He's amazing. So,
how did you get Salman Rushdie?
Honestly, I guess his publicity team recommended me.
Brilliant.
Because I guess I'd known the publicity people at his press for a while, because they would recommend authors, and they had seen me do interviews, and they said, we're going to give you the interview. I was really lucky. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your podcast, Acknowledgements, focuses on mentors behind authors. So what drew you to this concept, and what can listeners expect from this show?
I love that you've mentioned that, because I'm starting it up again in the fall. So I've taken a bit of a hiatus because, you know, it's hard to teach and, you know, write a book and also do a podcast at the same time.
And have a personal life. You're, you know, you're a mom. You have a dog.
I have a dog.
You
That's
know,
what I'm
your
a dog.
partner, and breathing, sleeping, living.
It's a lot of stuff. No, but we're going to restart Acknowledgements in the fall, and I think I love doing Sense of Place, but I'm really interested in this concept of radical reciprocity. So what does reciprocity look like on a radical scale? So thinking about how this interview in many ways is a reciprocal exchange of ideas, like you're learning from me and I'm learning from you. But I started thinking about the interview as a kind of binary opposition, meaning that you're hearing me, the person's hearing me talk, and then the person speaks back. Could I open it up to including a third person in the conversation? And I gave it some thought, and I thought, acknowledgements are always really fascinating in the book. It's the first place I turn to in a book, because acknowledgements always tell a story, right? The story behind the story. But I thought, how do I make acknowledgements an actual interview? And so that's how the idea of acknowledgements came to be. So what I would do is I would call up an author and say, tell me who you acknowledge in your book. And always, without a doubt, they would light up like a Christmas tree, because authors sometimes don't want to talk about their writing because they've been asked the same questions over and over again, but they're always happy to talk about who they love. I mean, if I was to ask you to speak about someone who inspires you, I'm sure you could talk on and on about that, because we're always so happy to speak about the people that we love or who inspires us. So I'd ask the author, why did you acknowledge this person in your book? And they would talk on and on about, oh my God, this person helped me write. They were so helpful to me. And then I'd say, okay, thanks. And then we would call up that person. And it was so amazing. And then what I would do,
That's such a brilliant.
don't you, it just makes so much sense. And then I would just get out of the way. And then they would talk, because often the person who is acknowledged in a book never really has had a chance to speak to the author about, well, why did you acknowledge me? And then they never had a chance to say, oh my God, I've never really talked about what it meant to me to see you acknowledge me in your book. And inevitably, when I got out of the way, a different kind of conversation would emerge, and there'd be tears and there'd be laughter, and I learned so much more about the relationship between those two people than I ever could just doing a one-on-one chat with the author, because they let their guard down. They become they present a different side of themselves because they're with someone who they cherish. It's a different nest of care. So I really loved doing that, and I can't wait to share some of the up-and-coming acknowledgements episodes for the future. We'll wait and see. Stay tuned.
Brilliant. A lot of tenderness, it sounds like.
Thank
a lot
you
of
for using that word,
vulnerability.
tenderness, yeah.
Earlier today, my first guest was someone who I really look up to. She's a producer, started out as an actor, and you know, we've been friends for a long time and almost sort of guiding each other, but I really look up to her a lot. And we sat down and I could just feel the amount of pressure that I felt, and then I acknowledged right away, because one of the things that I've learned is as soon as I voice whatever's going on with me, it releases its power, and to acknowledge how much this person means to me on camera, and it's a beautiful thing. So I want to talk about your upcoming book, and I would like to hear it from your words. Obviously, I mentioned to you there's quite a few parallels about the book. I'm not sure how much of it we can discuss, if we can talk about the title. So I leave it in your hands
and
to
again,
talk
that's
about
such
that
a
book.
generous thing for you to do, Zara, so thank you for that. And of course, I will honor how much of your own story you want to share as well, right? So these are difficult questions when we speak about loss and grief and love, and the stories that we want to share. So yeah, I have a book out October 1st. It's called May It Have a Happy Ending. It's a story about how I was gaining a voice in radio when my mom was losing hers. She got tongue cancer shortly after I started my job with Sense of Place doing my radio show. So really the book looks at what it means to amplify the stories of BIPOC writers while I was watching the stories of my ancestors get buried in my mother's mouth. So it's a very emotional story, but one that I'm proud to tell, and one that I feel was very inspired. I mean, if I was honest with you, I think my mom helped me write most of it. So she died 5 months after I started in radio.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, even the title is very powerful. May it have a happy ending. And I think after you sent me the book, thank you for accepting my request on Instagram and LinkedIn. And, it was late at night. I'm looking you up. I'm like, where is this woman? I need to find her. And then when I contacted you, you wrote back right away. And when I saw and I was looking through the book, and I had to stop and be like, is this real? Is it fact or fiction for a second, because of the parallels? And yeah, I think it's also around the same time, what we went through. So talk to me about the writing process, and how important was it for you to share this particular story?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just started doing a lot of journal writing at the time when my mom was going through the cancer treatments. And tongue cancer is one of the most painful of cancers. And it's not just getting things like radiation for head cancers, it's completely debilitating. And I think all cancer is really bad, don't get me wrong, but the loss of being able to taste and eat and enjoy food, the loss of being able to speak when you have tongue cancer, it's really, I really was not prepared for what that meant for me to watch my mother lose the ability. I mean, my mother used to love to eat. Food was really important to her, and not having the chance to enjoy food anymore was really traumatizing for her. And then, of course, she couldn't speak anymore very shortly after she was diagnosed. So we had to rely on hand gestures and writing. But it's a very debilitating form of cancer, as all cancers are. So that was very hard for me to witness and to go through that with her. So the book really traces that story about what it meant for me to find out she was diagnosed with rapidly advancing tongue cancer. She was in Toronto. I was out here. I was constantly flying back and forth, meanwhile trying to do my radio show, but I was a wreck because I kept on worrying about her. I would try to go back for appointment after appointment, but meanwhile I was doing a daily radio show and I had a 3-year-old son and a husband, and trying to juggle all these things became really difficult and debilitating. So I just started writing, used writing as a form of therapy to think about how I could make sense of what was happening when nothing made sense, right? None of it was ever going to make sense again. And so I just kept on writing and writing and writing, and eventually the book came to pass. And of course, a lot of it has been written after she died. So I'm in a different place now than I was when I was going through the trauma of watching her go through what she did. So I have a bit of distance now, but really I wrote this book as a way of trying to offer solace to people who've gone through something similar. I mean, a lot of us have lost a parent, if not both. And I find, particularly for people of color, there's no great books that help us experience what it means to lose a parent who has died.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I think there's great books like Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, and a lot of us have turned to that book in times of struggle, but I wanted a book that, to quote Anne Michaels, this idea of, I see now that I must give what I most need. I wanted to give what I most needed at that time, because when you lose a parent, it's like your DNA is forever changed, right? A part of your body has been cut off, and you look the same, and people can say to you, I'm so sorry, but these are such empty words when you're just trying to get through day to day without the person who's been by your side your entire life. And it's deeply emotional and it's difficult. So I wanted to be able to offer a space for people to understand that you're not alone.
How do you feel about going on perhaps like a press tour of such a personal matter, and especially because you were very close to your mom? And how would that feel for you to share about, such, because even for me, it's been 7 years, but my mom was a single parent. There wasn't really much age difference between me and my mother. So she had me at 17. My mom passed away on her 52nd birthday. And I was her primary caregiver. And I have 2 younger brothers, but we had lost my brother's wife a couple of years prior, so our family had gone through that, so they had kind of checked out a little bit emotionally. So doing all the rites of passage and organizing things in advance and signing the papers and all of that, and not really having any family from her side here, so carrying that was, and in my personal view, I find it fascinating that it was off the mouth, because I don't think my mother really got a chance to say a lot of the things that needed to be said. So at least that's what I do believe, that it's psychosomatic, that that it's no surprise that it was, but she loved me, gave me so much confidence and believed in me so that I am who I am today.
I want to say first of all, I'm so sorry that you've gone through that, 'cause that's so difficult. Also, I cannot believe that our mothers have that in common, like the kind of mouth cancer thing, again, because it is quite rare. Although the more research I did, the more I started realizing that it's more common among BIPOC women, right?
That's oral cancer, 100%.
Right? Yeah. And I think you're right. It's about that idea of not being able to speak the grief and the trauma that's in their bodies, which is why it's so important that these stories are shared, like that we have to speak our truth, right? Otherwise, that lives in bodies in ways that's not healthy, right? So we have to speak.
Yeah, Dr. Gabor Mate, I saw him at a conference with his wife, Ray, a few months ago, and Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, and he talks about that how women have more autoimmune diseases compared to men because of holding all the anger inside. And
You gotta get it out.
yeah, and especially for women of color.
Absolutely.
Who would you say have been some of your most influential mentors, and how have they shaped your career and approach to social justice and academia?
You know, I love this question because I really believe in the power of mentorship. And a lot of people that I consider as part of my constellation of mentors has shifted and changed over time. And how much time do you got? I could talk about this for ad nauseum. But probably one of my most important mentors is a woman named Shireen Razak. She's a Muslim professor who I met at University of Toronto, and now she holds an endowed chair in gender studies at UCLA. But she's been in my corner every step of the way since I became a professor, and I've learned a lot from her. She's written some hugely important books about racism in Canada. One of the books, the title you'll love, it's called Looking White People in the Eye, which is like a mic drop title for any book. But I've really learned a lot from her. And then I have a lot of really good friends who I consider to be mentors to. People like Marilyn Young, who's at the School of Journalism here at UBC. We've been friends for 20 years, and she has stood by me and offered me great advice and support since I started at journalism schools teaching. So I'm really lucky that a number of these people have been in my camps, and really can't thank them enough.
You've engaged with the community through various programs and initiatives. How do you see the role of academia in fostering community relationships and addressing social issues?
Yeah, I love this question because, you know, we often think about UBC as being the university up on the hill, right? And particularly like so far away, the ivory tower is so separated from the communities that we have on the ground. And because I've had a love and hate relationship with academia, I've always been in and out of it. Either I'm a professor and then I go back to TV, and then I go into radio, and then I go back to teaching. It's always about thinking through how these spaces intersect and how they can work together. So how can the university be attuned to questions of social justice on the ground? Because often that can be a bit of an elitist space. I mean, definitely an elitist space up at the university. So it's our responsibility to recognize that there are spaces on the ground here on the streets that speak to the university environment. Everything always has to go back and connect with that. I'll give you an example of how I've seen this work in my own teaching. So the way I teach the 101 course is the students read books, mostly novels and memoirs, and then I invite the writer to come in to speak with the class. So it's a different way of reading the book. Once you read the book, you have all these preconceived ideas about what you should take away, but when the author says, this was my intention, it helps you rethink your impact, the impact of the book a little bit more. And that's an important relationship to understand, intent and the impact, particularly for social justice work. So one of the unanticipated joys of teaching this way is the students would read the book, they'd meet the author, and then they would come to me and say, oh my God, Professor Mahtani, I had no idea how cool this author is. And then they'd take the book and tell their parents about it. And then the parents would call me and said, oh my God, this is so cool. My kid is learning in your class. Can I come and sit in on your class? And they're not part of the university environment, right? But they want to learn as well because it connects them with their child through the process of learning. So it opens up the classroom into a different space beyond the ivory tower, beyond the lecture hall, right? And so I really think that's our responsibility. And that's why my book, quite frankly, my new book, it's not an academic book. I made a deliberate decision not to write an academic book. Now, are there lots of little stealth moments of intellectual work in the book? Absolutely. But hopefully, I don't hit you on the head with that. Hopefully there are stories that are compelling and interesting and make you think about the world in a different way.
Yeah, beautiful. Looking ahead, what are, other than your book and acknowledgements and everything else, I know your plate is full, but is there something else that you're excited about pursuing or hoping to, or something else that you may be working on behind closed curtains? I know you have a lot on your plate.
Honestly, I have not I just want to get this book out in the world,
Yeah.
and hopefully people will enjoy it and get something out of it. And I'm just looking forward to the tour. Inshallah, it'll all go okay.
Yeah. And I'm so excited we get to be the first ones to have you on.
No, you're the very first interview I'm doing around the book. So thank you again for having me. It's been such a joy to speak with you.
Yeah, same here. I'm so grateful. I think, stars came to, everything happened for a reason. You showed up on Google. I just happened to punch in the right words.
Well, our
and
mothers are speaking to one another.
You said that over the phone. You're right. Well, thank you so much, Minelle.
Thank you for
Before
having
we
me.
let you go, I love asking everyone who comes on the show if there's a particular place in the city they like going to for inspiration, whether it's a trail or a cafe or a gallery, just to disconnect from your world that you'd like to share with our audience.
I mean, we're on one of my favorite streets in the city, because I used to live just around here, and we're so close to kids' books, which holds a special place in my heart because my son used to go there all the time when he was super, super little. And I love going there and just immersing myself in all the stories that are up on the shelves. So I'd have to say, given the proximity to kids' books, that it's a very special place for me, a sacred place for me. Yeah.
I think moving away from downtown, I live in Yaletown, and coming this part of the city, everything calms down a little bit. The streets are a little bit wider, there's more trees, the air smells a little bit different, not as much chaos. So one of these days I'll be moving to this part of the city.
Inshallah, we'll make it happen.
Inshallah, that will happen. Well, thank you so much for
Thanks so much,
joining
Sarah.
us, for accommodating to our schedule. I truly appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
Is there anything else that I missed today that you would like to share with our audience before you go?
No, I hope people will buy the book, and I appreciate you speaking with me.
My pleasure. And we will make sure that we share Minelle's website with you so you can they purchase it from the website?
You can
It will be
pre-order
available.
it now, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. It's available for pre-order.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And it will be out on October 1st.
That's it. Yeah,
Great.
with a big launch at VPL. So
Great.
yeah.
Signed book with the author.
Totally. Yeah.
Bravo. I'll be lining up.
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you.
You'll have to invite us. Make
for
sure
sure.
it's in my calendar. Okay. Minelle Mahtani, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, I'm your host, Zara Durrani. This show is produced with the support of Tell Us Story Hive, and we're filming here today in the heart of Kitsilano at Folk Restaurant. Hope to hear from you. Thank you.